She sat across from him at the dinner table. No shouting, no tears, no anger, just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be broken. It was the kind that already said goodbye. Her eyes weren't cold. They were empty, like something inside her had quietly packed its bags and left. He stared, confused. I stayed. I worked hard. I never cheated. I don't understand. But that's just it. He didn't understand, because what he thought was strength, not complaining, not expressing, not falling apart, had become a wall she could no longer reach through. And the truth, his silence was the loudest thing in the room, not because he didn't care, but because she meant more to him than he knew how to handle. And somewhere deep in his shadow, he believed if she truly saw him, she might leave first. You'd be surprised how many men over 50 say the exact same thing. I never cheated. I never yelled. I worked hard. I provided. I just don't get why she left. They say it with real pain, real confusion, as if a piece of life's puzzle is missing. And no matter how long they stare at the empty space, it won't make sense. But let me tell you about someone, a man like many others. Call him Daniel. He was 58 when the divorce papers arrived, married 28 years, raised 2 kids, paid off the house, never strayed, didn't drink too much, didn't party, didn't gamble. He stayed. And in his mind, that meant everything. He wasn't like his own father, a man who had walked away when Daniel was still. In middle school, he prided himself on being different, reliable, solid, loyal. But here's what Daniel didn't realize. You can be present in the room and still feel completely absent in someone's life. In the early years, he and his wife, Laura, used to talk for hours. She loved that he listened, even if he didn't always have the words. She once told her friends, "He's quiet, but he makes me feel safe." But over the years, life piled up. Work got harder. Their son dropped out of college. Her mother passed. His brother got sick. And somewhere along the way, the conversations faded. The dinners that used to linger with laughter turned into silent meals eaten in front of the TV. She stopped reaching for his hand in the car. He didn't notice when she started going to bed, early, without saying goodnight. When she cried in the kitchen one night after losing her job, he handed her a towel. He told her everything would be okay. Then he went outside to fix the fence. He thought he was helping, being strong, doing what a man is supposed to do. He didn't see that what she needed wasn't a solution. It was a connection. She needed his heart, not just his hands. But Daniel never learned how to offer that. His love was practical, quiet, predictable. He thought love was not leaving. He thought love was not yelling. He thought love was not being like the men who hurt her before. But love is not just the absence of harm. It's the presence of attunement, of being emotionally available, of noticing when someone's light is dimming, and daring to ask why. Daniel wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who had never been taught how to be emotionally present. And Laura, she tried. At first, she spoke up, told him she missed how they used to be, that she felt lonely. He nodded, said he'd try harder, then returned to his spreadsheet, his lawn, his weekend projects. She waited. Then she waited some more. And finally, she stopped waiting, not out of cruelty, not because she didn't love him, but because her soul couldn't survive the starvation anymore. The truth is, she wasn't asking Daniel to be perfect. She was asking him to be real, to take off the armor, to sit with her pain without trying to fix it, to let her into the soft, unspoken parts of his heart. But he didn't know how. No one had shown him what that looked like. No one had ever asked him to go there before. So, like many men, he mistook silence for safety, distance for peace. He thought the absence of conflict meant everything was okay, but the absence of connection is just as deadly. It just dies more slowly. And one day, he came home to find the suitcase packed. The light in her eyes, gone. The smell of her perfume still clinging to the pillows, but her presence vanished. Later, when the pain finally cracked him open, he would ask his therapist, "What did I do wrong?" And the answer would come softly, like a truth he'd always feared. "It's not what you did. It's what you didn't see." Because real love isn't about checking the right boxes. It's about noticing the spaces between the words, the tension behind her smile, the sadness inside her silence. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking to be seen, and maybe deep down, he was afraid that if she really looked into him, she'd see all the places he was still hiding from himself. By the time a relationship reaches its breaking point, the signs have usually been there for years. John Gottman calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. 4 behaviors that predict divorce with startling accuracy: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and the quietest of them all, stonewalling. That's the one Daniel fell into. Stonewalling doesn't mean he screamed or slammed doors. It means he shut down, tuned out. He thought he was keeping the peace, that when really he was building a wall. He told himself, if I just stay calm, things won't get worse. If I don't say anything, maybe it'll blow over. But nothing blew over, because beneath the still surface, something deeper was brewing. Here's where Carl Jung comes in, where Gottman explains the behavior. Jung explains the soul behind it. According to Jung, every person has a shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny, suppress, or never learned how to face. And for men, especially those raised to value stoicism, success, and emotional control, the shadow often holds things like fear of vulnerability, feelings of inadequacy, longing for tenderness, past emotional wounds, the need to be seen, comforted, understood. But when those parts go unacknowledged, they don't disappear. They get projected, often onto the woman he loves most. Here's how it plays out. He meets her. She's warm, expressive, emotionally alive. She feels like sunlight, like everything he never let himself be. At first, that draws him in, but over time, that same emotional intensity starts to feel threatening. Not because she's wrong, but because she reflects back to him the parts of himself he's buried. The more emotionally available she becomes, the more exposed he feels, like her presence is peeling away his carefully constructed identity, layer by layer. And suddenly, he's not just reacting to her, he's reacting to his own unconscious. Her desire for closeness begins to feel like pressure, her questions sound like criticism, her longing feels like accusation. So he withdraws. He doesn't say it out loud, but inside he thinks, I can't give her what she wants. I'm not enough. If she sees who I really am, she'll leave. This is projection in action. Jung said, we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. He ignores her, not because he doesn't care, but because she matters too much. Her love opens a door to parts of himself he doesn't want to enter. And that's terrifying when your inner world is full of locked rooms. He pulls away to protect himself, not from her, but from his own shadow, the deep, repressed emotional pain he never learned to process. It's not logical. It's not mature, but it's deeply human. The tragedy is she takes his silence personally, and he assumes she's better off without his brokenness. And so 2 people who once loved each other deeply end up living in emotional exile, each convinced the other no longer cares. But the truth is far more tender, far more raw. He didn't pull away because she was unworthy of love. He pulled away because he never believed he was. And her presence, her heart, her vulnerability touched a nerve he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Carl Jung once wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Stonewalling wasn't his decision. It was his conditioning. His silence wasn't strength. It was inherited survival. But now, he's beginning to see it for what it really is. A wall built not to protect his marriage, but to protect himself from his own truth. And the saddest part? It worked too well. It didn't happen all at once. Awareness rarely does. It was little things at first, barely noticeable. The way the house echoed more at night. The sound of one fork clinking against one plate. The dust gathering on picture frames that hadn't been touched since the kids moved out. Daniel would walk past his daughter's old bedroom and pause. He'd hear her laugh, not in real life, but in memory. He couldn't remember the last time she called without needing something. His son had grown distant too, kind, polite, but not close, not real. And then there was Laura, still living in the same house, but for now, still making coffee in the morning, still folding his shirts with that same careful touch. But her eyes no longer lingered. Her smile didn't reach. One night he caught her looking at him across the table, not with anger, not with love, but with a kind of distant compassion. Like someone grieving something they'd already let go of. That look haunted him. For the first time, something cracked. And a thought he had never allowed himself to consider drifted in like a whisper. What if I wasn't just the one being ignored? What if I was the one who disappeared first? He always thought silence was strength, that real men kept things to themselves, that emotions were burdens women carried, and men simply endured. But now the silence felt like a ghost he couldn't escape. Empty rooms, grown kids who had learned not to need him emotionally, a woman who once reached for him in sleep now curled to the edge of the bed. This was the cost, and it was higher than he'd ever imagined. He used to think she changed, that she grew cold, that maybe she wanted too much. But then a different question surfaced, one that stopped him in his tracks. What if she never truly saw me, and I never let her? The thought was terrifying, because if that was true, it meant the life he built, the marriage, the family, the decades, had been lived behind a veil. That maybe he had given his time, his work, his duty, but not himself. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Daniel always blamed fate, the fading romance, the quiet house, the distant kids, the disconnection. He told himself, that's just how long-term relationships go. But what if that wasn't fate? What if it was the result of years of small choices, to retreat, to numb, to avoid? What if silence was never strength, but fear dressed in a quieter costume? The fear of being truly known. The fear that if someone saw everything, the shame, the doubts, the cracks, they'd run, and so he kept it all in, the loneliness, the need, the grief of being human in a world that only applauds stoicism. But now, for the first time, he realized he wasn't protecting his wife from his darkness. He was protecting himself from her light, because her light would reveal things he wasn't ready to face. The wall he thought kept things stable, kept love out. The mask he wore to look strong made him a stranger, and in this quiet reckoning, Daniel stopped blaming. He stopped pointing fingers at her changing moods, her coldness, her distance, and he started doing something far more difficult. He turned inward. He looked into the mirror. Really looked. Not for flaws, not to fix his hair or straighten his tie, but to ask, who am I when I'm not performing? Who was I before the silence became my second skin? That's where healing begins, not in answers but in honest questions, and maybe, just maybe, that's where love begins again too. For most of his life, Daniel thought emotions were something to manage, not embrace. That love meant protection, not presence. That strength was about holding the line, not opening the door. But then came the silence, the distance, the woman slipping away, not because she stopped loving him, but because she no longer felt met. And now, in the aftermath of all he didn't say, he begins to feel something stir. Not anger, not even grief. Something quieter, but more alive, a knowing. Carl Jung spoke of the anima, the inner feminine within every man. Not weakness, not softness, but the part that feels, intuits, nurtures, longs, the part that knows how to hold without fixing, to listen without rushing, to love without armor. Daniel had buried that part a long time ago. He thought it had no place in a man's life. That emotion was dangerous. That tenderness was a trap. But here's the truth. She, Laura, didn't leave because he lacked strength. She pulled away because he hid his soul, not from her, but from himself. He ignored her, not because she wasn't important, but because she touched the part of him he had abandoned. She stirred the anima. And when you've spent a lifetime being taught that part of you should never be seen, you run from the very thing you crave. Here's what he begins to see now. She wasn't asking for a hero. She never needed a savior. She wasn't waiting for him to fix her pain, solve her moods, or be her everything. She was asking for one thing, a witness, someone to sit beside her in the silence, to look her in the eye and stay present when she unraveled, to say without words, "You're not too much, I'm here." But Daniel was never taught how to be that man, not by his father, not by society, not even by the mirror. And so he projected. He cast his discomfort with intimacy onto her neediness. He labeled her longing as emotional. He dismissed her desire for connection as drama, because if her feelings were valid, he'd have to feel his own, and that terrified him. But now he understands that projection is a mirror. Every time he distanced himself, it wasn't her he was running from. It was his shadow, all the unloved parts of himself. The boy who never felt seen, the man who never allowed grief, the heart that always ached for depth but didn't know where to begin. Jung called the process of healing individuation, the journey of becoming whole, not perfect, not invincible, but whole. It begins when you stop blaming others for your discomfort and start exploring what lives beneath it, when you stop outsourcing your identity to what you do and begin asking who you are. And in that journey, something miraculous happens. The wall you built to protect your heart becomes a door. The silence you thought was safety becomes a language of fear, and love becomes possible again, but not the old kind. The transactional, role-based, surface-level love, a deeper love, the kind that listens with its whole body, the kind that says, "I see your shadow and I'm not leaving," the kind that embraces the broken parts, not to fix them, but to honor them. Daniel may not win Laura back. Not every love story ends in reunion, but this part of his journey, this awakening, isn't about getting her back. It's about getting himself back. The man behind the mask, the soul behind the silence, the heart that finally said, "I'm ready to feel." And in that quiet return, he doesn't just reclaim love, he reclaims wholeness. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that it scared you, so instead of moving closer, you pulled away, hid in silence, disappeared behind work, distractions, or busyness? Or maybe you were on the other side, waiting, hoping, longing for the person you loved to finally see you, not for what you did or gave or sacrificed, but for who you are. If that's you, say it. Drop a comment below. I mattered, and he couldn't face it. Or I ignored her, because I wasn't ready to meet myself. This space is for truth, not shame, not blame, just truth. The kind that heals. Carl Jung reminded us that what we don't bring to light will run our lives in the dark. But you're here now. You're listening. You're awakening. Your silence doesn't have to be the end of your story. It might just be the beginning of something far more real, a love that starts from within. If this spoke to your heart, don't just scroll away. Share your story. Connect in the comments. And remember, you're not alone, not anymore.